The rain had been falling for hours, drenching the highway in a cold, slick sheen. Truck driver Hank Mercer gripped the steering wheel of his 18-wheeler, his knuckles white as he fought against the wind that buffeted his rig. It was nearly 2 a.m., the dead hour, when most of the world was asleep, except for the restless souls that roamed the lonely roads. Hank had been driving long-haul routes for nearly 20 years, but there was something about this particular stretch of highway in the deep woods of West Virginia that never sat right with him. It was an old road, barely maintained, winding through dense forests that swallowed the moonlight. Other truckers had told stories about strange sightings, phantom hitchhikers, and eerie whispers carried on the wind, but Hank never paid them much mind. He didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until that night. He was somewhere between Charleston and the Kentucky border when he saw the first sign of trouble. A figure stood on the side of the road just beyond the reach of his headlights. Hank squinted through the rain-smeared windshield. It was a woman. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, long and tattered, the kind women wore in the 1930s. Her dark hair hung in wet strands around her pale face. She didn't move as his truck rumbled closer. That just stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, shivering. Hank's foot hovered over the brake. He had a rule: never pick up hitchhikers. Too many horror stories. Too many chances of getting robbed, or worse. But something about the woman nagged at him. She looked lost, alone, desperate. Against his better judgment, Hank slowed the truck and pulled to the side of the road. He leaned over, cranking down the passenger window. "Ma'am, you need a ride somewhere?" he called. She turned her head slowly. The motion sent a chill through Hank's spine. Her face was too pale, almost translucent under the dim glow of his dashboard lights. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. He hesitated. Something about her didn't feel right. The woman stepped forward, her bare feet soundless against the wet pavement. Hank felt his stomach twist. Her dress was old, but it wasn't just tattered. It was burnt. Singed at the edges, blackened in places, like she had walked through fire. His gut screamed at him to drive away. Then she spoke. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Hank swallowed hard. He wasn't a man to turn away someone in need, but every instinct told him to leave her there. He reached for the door handle, then froze. The air inside the truck had gone ice cold. The woman was closer now, standing right outside the cab, her dark eyes staring into his. Her lips moved again. This time, Hank heard her clearly. "They're coming." His blood ran cold. Before he could ask what she meant, a sudden movement in the side mirror caught his attention. Shadows. Dozens of them, shifting along the tree line. Something was watching him. No, many things were watching him. The woman's head jerked to the side as if she had heard something behind her. Then she turned back to Hank, panic flashing across her face. "Drive," she pleaded. That was all the convincing he needed. Hank slammed the truck into gear and peeled away, his tires kicking up water and gravel. In the rearview mirror, the woman still stood there, watching him go. And behind her, the shadows moved. Hank didn't stop until he reached a gas station 20 miles down the road. His hands were shaking as he pulled into the empty lot. He killed the engine and sat in silence, trying to make sense of what he had seen. The woman, the shadows. What the hell had just happened? He got out of the cab, lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, and leaned against the truck. The night was still, no rain, no wind, too quiet. Then, in the reflection of his truck's side mirror, a face. He spun around, but there was nothing there, just the darkness beyond the edge of the parking lot. The cigarette slipped from his fingers. A low whisper crawled through the air. "They're coming." Hank didn't sleep that night. He kept driving, pushing through exhaustion until the sun broke over the mountains. He never spoke of what he had seen, but he avoided that stretch of highway from then on. Years later, he overheard another trucker talking about the same road, about a woman in a burnt dress who appeared on rainy nights, warning drivers before vanishing into thin air. "People say she died in a fire back in the 30s, the trucker said. "Some old boarding house went up in flames, killed a bunch of folks. Nobody ever figured out how it started, but ever since then, truckers see her out there, always saying the same thing." Hank's throat went dry. "They're coming." He never drove that route again, but some nights, when the rain was heavy and the roads were empty, he still felt like something was watching him, waiting, and he knew they were still coming.
Story number 2.
The 2-lane highway stretched endlessly through the desolate Arizona desert, the yellow lines glowing under the dim headlights of Jim Carter's 18-wheeler. The only sound was the low hum of the diesel engine and the occasional gust of wind rattling against the cab. It was past 3 a.m., the dead hour, when the world felt too quiet, too empty. Jim had been driving long-haul routes for over 15 years, but he always hated this particular stretch of Highway 89. There were too many stories. Truckers who disappeared, strange figures on the side of the road, radio interference when driving through the unmarked miles between towns. Jim wasn't superstitious, but he'd heard enough from other drivers to know that some places weren't meant for people. His CB radio crackled. For the last hour, the static had been worsening. He adjusted the dial, hoping to pip another trucker's voice, but the static only grew louder. Then, a whisper. Faint, distorted, and impossible to make out. Jim frowned and turned the volume down. Probably just interference from the storm rolling in behind him. The desert got strange at night, and he wasn't about to spook himself over a bit of bad reception. Up ahead, the road curved slightly, revealing an old gas station. It stood alone in the darkness, its fluorescent sign flickering weakly. Jim checked his fuel gauge. Half a tank, plenty to get to the next big stop. But something about the gas station pulled at him. He didn't remember ever seeing it before, though he'd driven this route 100 times. His fingers tightened on the wheel. Something was off. The gas station looked abandoned. The pumps were rusted, the windows dark, no cars, no signs of life. And yet, the neon open sign flickered in the window. A strange sense of unease crept up Jim's spine. Against his better judgment, he slowed the truck and pulled into the lot, untaped, his tires crunching over loose gravel. The moment he cut the engine, silence swallowed everything. No wind, no crickets. Just the hum of the old lights above the station buzzing like angry wasps. Jim hesitated before climbing out of the cab. The desert night was cooler than it should have been, the air thick with an odd metallic scent. He glanced around. No sign of an attendant, no movement behind the grimy windows. Just as he was about to turn back, a sudden voice crackled over his CB radio. "Don't go in there." Jim froze. The voice was distorted, almost robotic, but he could make out the words clear as day. His heart pounded as he stepped back toward the truck, his instincts screaming at him to leave. The gas station door creaked open. Jim spun around, his breath catching in his throat. A figure stood in the doorway. It was a man, at least Jim thought it was. He was tall and thin, his limbs slightly too long, like his skin grayish and stretched tight over his bones. His face was obscured in shadow, but his eyes reflected the light unnaturally, glowing like a cat's in the dark. Jim took a step back. The man stepped forward. "Need some gas?" the figure asked, his voice hollow like it was coming from deep underground. Jim's pulse hammered in his ears. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The figure's head twitched unnaturally to the side. "You should come inside. Got coffee." Jim forced himself to move, backing toward his truck without turning away from the thing in the doorway. The man took another step forward. "Come inside," he repeated, his voice overlapping itself like a broken tape playing out of sync. Jim grabbed the door handle and yanked it open. As soon as his foot hit the cab step, every single light in the gas station cut out. The darkness was instant, total. And from that darkness, a sound. Low, wet, clicking. Jim didn't wait. He threw himself into the cab, slammed the door, and locked it. His hands trembled as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and in the sudden flood of headlights, the figure was gone. The gas station was gone. Nothing but empty desert stretched before him. Jim's breath hitched. His truck was still in the gravel lot. He could feel the uneven ground beneath the tires. But the building, the neon sign, the rusted pumps had vanished. His CB crackled again. Static. "Then, you saw it, didn't you?" Jim's mouth went dry. A different voice this time. Male. Low. "You're not the first," the voice said. "Keep driving. Don't stop again." Jim threw the truck into gear and pulled back onto the highway, his hands shaking against the wheel. In the rearview mirror that stretched endlessly behind him, empty and dark. But just before he lost sight of where the gas station had been, for a fraction of a second, the neon sign flickered back to life. Open. Then, it was gone. Jim never drove that route again. Other truckers had their own stories, their own warnings. Some had seen the same station. Some had seen other things. People standing too still on the side of the road, headlights that appeared in their mirrors but never passed them, whispers over the radio saying things they shouldn't know. No one ever figured it out where, but everyone agreed on one thing. Some places on the highway weren't meant for stopping, and if you saw something strange in the middle of the night, you kept driving.
Story number 3.
The highway was empty except for Tom Grady's rig, the roar of the engine the only sound breaking the silence of the night. He was hauling a load through northern Montana, cutting through miles of open road surrounded by nothing but darkness and endless fields. Tom had been driving for 20 years, and he knew how lonely these roads could get. Truckers swapped ghost stories all the time. Phantom hitchhikers, weird lights in the sky, things that moved just outside the edges of your headlights. He never put much stock in them. Until that night. It started with a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. Tom spotted him in the distance, just standing there, staring into the darkness. He barely moved, barely even shifted his weight. Tom figured he was some drifter, maybe a stranded motorist, but as his headlights swept over the man, his stomach tightened. He was tall, too tall. His limbs were long and thin, his clothes tattered like he had been walking for days. His head was tilted at an odd angle, as if his neck was slightly broken. Most disturbing of all, he had no face. Tom's hands clenched on the wheel, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin where his features should have been. His pulse spiked, but he kept driving. Whatever that thing was, he wasn't stopping. As his truck rumbled past, he risked one glance at the side mirror. The figure was gone. A shiver ran down Tom's spine. He swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter. It had to be his imagination, maybe a trick of the headlights. But then a voice crackled through his CB radio. It was pure static at first, but then he heard something beneath it. Breathing. Slow. Wet. Uneven. Then, "You should stop, Tom." Tom's skin went cold. No one had called him by name. His radio had been silent for hours. His throat tightened, and he reached forward, twisting the dial, but the static only got worse. A whisper broke through. "You saw me." Tom slammed his hand against the radio, cutting it off completely. He kept his eyes locked on the road, heart pounding in his chest. Then something moved in the back of his cab. The sound was soft, like fabric shifting against leather. His breath caught. He kept his eyes forward. He was alone. Wasn't he? Swallowing hard, he reached for the small mirror above his windshield, angling it slightly to see behind him. And there, sitting in the passenger seat, was the faceless man. Tom's heart nearly exploded out of his chest. He swerved violently, his tires screeching against the asphalt as he fought to keep control of the rig. When he finally straightened out, gasping for breath, he forced himself to look at the seat. It was empty. His fingers were shaking as he wiped sweat from his brow. He had been on the road too long. That had to be it. He needed sleep. He needed a break. He needed to get off this cursed highway. Up ahead, a small truck stop appeared in the distance, its flickering neon lights a beacon of safety. He pulled in without hesitation, parking his rig near the far end of the lot where a few other trucks were idling. He needed a damn cup of coffee. Climbing out of the cab, he stretched, inhaling the crisp night air, trying to shake the nerves still clawing at his chest. The truck stop was quiet, just a few other drivers inside. He ordered a coffee, sat at the counter, and tried to calm down. An older trucker sitting a few seats away glanced at him. "You all right, son?" Tom hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just long drive." The old man chuckled, sipping his own coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Tom exhaled. "Something like that." The old man's smile faded slightly. "Where you driving in from?" "Couple 100 miles back, near the I-87 junction." The trucker's face darkened. "Saw anything weird?" Tom hesitated. The faceless man, the voice on the radio, the thing in his cab. "Maybe," Tom admitted. "Why?" The old man set his coffee down. "You ain't the first." Tom's stomach clenched. "You truckers ever hear about the Wendigo?" The man continued, voice lowering. "It's an old legend, comes from these parts. They say it's a spirit that lures folks out onto the roads, makes them see things, hear things, makes them stop." Tom's fingers tightened around his cup. "And what happens if they stop?" he asked. The trucker's gaze was steady. "They don't start again." Tom felt his pulse hammering against his ribs. "You said you saw something," the old man said. "What did it look like?" Tom hesitated. Then, before he could answer, his truck horn blared outside, long, loud, like someone had climbed into the cab and leaned on it. Tom shot up, his blood turning to ice. Other truckers in the diner turned toward the noise. "You expecting company?" the old man asked. Tom didn't answer. He bolted for the door, rushing out into the night. His rig sat where he had left it, its headlights still off, its engine dead. But his driver's side door was open. Tom's breath hitched. No, he had locked it. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped toward the cab, heart hammering against his ribs. The air was heavy, thick with something he couldn't name. Then, a whisper. "Come inside." It came from the cab. Tom's feet froze. Something moved in the shadows of the truck's interior. Long limbs, stretching, unfolding, and then a face. Or rather, the lack of one. The faceless man was sitting in his driver's seat, head tilted slightly, and though he had no eyes, Tom knew it was looking right at him. The thing lifted one bony hand and tapped the dashboard radio. Static poured out, filling the air around him, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside his skull. Then, "You should stop, Tom." Tom stumbled back, his breath ragged, his vision tunneling. He turned, running full speed toward the truck stop, not stopping until he was inside, slamming the door behind him. The old trucker was already standing, watching him. "You saw it," he said quietly. Tom couldn't speak, couldn't move. The trucker sighed. "Best forget about that truck." Tom swallowed hard. What do you mean?" The man just shook his head. "That thing ain't yours no more." Tom turned, looking back through the truck stop's glass windows. His rig sat there, the door still open, waiting. But the longer he stared, the more he felt like something inside was smiling at him, waiting for him to come back, to get in, to drive just a little further down the road. But Tom knew, if he got back in that truck, he would never get back out.
Story number 4.
The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in both directions. The long, empty highway illuminated only by the glow of Jim Rourke's headlights. His 18-wheeler rumbled down the lonesome road, hauling a load of industrial supplies toward Nevada. He had been driving for nearly 8 hours straight, his only company the occasional crackle of his CB radio. The night was deep and silent, the kind of silence that made the world feel abandoned. No other cars, no signs of life, just the road and the black void beyond it. Jim had been driving long-haul routes for over 20 years, and he'd heard plenty of stories. Things that didn't belong on the road, things that didn't make sense. But he was a practical man. He didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until that night. The first sign of trouble came when his CB radio crackled to life. At first, it was static. He reached for the dial to adjust the frequency, thinking maybe another trucker was nearby. Then, the whispering started. Faint, distorted, like a voice too far away to hear clearly. Jim frowned and turned up the volume, trying to make out the words. Then, clear as day, a voice broke through the static. "Help me." Jim's hands clenched on the wheel. The voice was soft, a woman's voice. "Help me," it repeated, barely a whisper now. Jim glanced at the CB channel. There was no ID, no call sign. Then something even stranger happened. His headlights flickered. Only for a second, just a brief pulse of darkness before they stabilized again. But in that split second, something appeared on the side of the road. A figure. A woman. Jim's breath caught. She was standing just beyond the reach of his headlights, barely visible in the darkness. Her dress was pale and tattered, billowing slightly in the desert wind. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face. Jim's first thought was that she was a stranded motorist. Maybe her car had broken down, maybe she needed help. But as he got closer, something felt wrong. She wasn't moving, not even a little, not shifting her weight, not blinking, just standing there, motionless. Then, as his rig thundered past her, she turned her head, slowly, too slowly, and Jim saw her face. Her eyes were pitch black, no whites, no pupils, just empty voids that seemed to stretch forever. His stomach lurched, and he jerked the wheel slightly, nearly veering onto the shoulder. Then, the headlights flickered again, and she was gone. Jim's breath came hard and fast. No, she had been there. Hadn't she? He forced himself to calm down. Maybe he was tired, maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. Then his CB crackled again. "Help me." Jim's skin crawled. It was the same voice, the same woman. But this time, it came from inside the cab. A shudder ran down Jim's spine. Slowly, stiffly, he turned his head toward the passenger seat. And there she was, sitting next to him. Her pale dress was torn, her hands resting limply in her lap. Her long, dark hair hung over her face, but through the strands he could see her black, bottomless eyes staring at him. Jim couldn't breathe. The truck veered slightly and he yanked the wheel back, trying not to lose control. When he looked back at the seat, she was gone. But something lingered. The air in the cab was ice cold, and the smell burnt flesh. Jim's pulse hammered in his ears. He had to stop, had to pull over, but something inside him screamed not to. Then his CB crackled one last time. "Don't stop." Jim swallowed hard, his throat dry. The voice was different this time. A man's voice. Low, urgent. "You keep driving," the voice said, "no matter what you see." Jim's grip tightened on the wheel, then the headlights flickered one more time, and suddenly there was a car in the road ahead of him, a rusted old sedan right in his lane. No time to react, no time to think. Jim slammed the brakes, his tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck lurched violently, the trailer fishtailing behind him, and just as he was about to hit the car, it vanished. Jim's truck skidded to a stop in the middle of the road, the trailer swaying dangerously before settling. His chest heaved, sweat dripping down his brow. There was nothing there. No car. No woman. Just the empty highway stretching before him. Jim sat there, gripping the wheel, his knuckles white. Then, slowly, he looked in the side mirror and nearly screamed. She was standing there, right behind the truck, closer now. Much closer. Her head was tilted unnaturally, her black eyes fixed on him, and her mouth, it was wrong, too wide, split open as if someone had torn it at the corners. She smiled, then the CB crackled again. Drive. Jim didn't hesitate. He slammed the truck into gear and hit the gas, his heart pounding as he sped down the highway. In the rearview mirror, the woman stood motionless, watching him go. And just before she disappeared into the darkness, her voice whispered through the radio one last time. You'll be back. Jim never drove that route again. Other truckers had their own stories. They had seen her too, the woman with the black eyes. Some said she had died in a car accident decades ago. Some said she had never been human at all, but they all agreed on one thing. If you saw her on the side of the road, you never ever stopped.
Story number 5.
The long-haul route through West Texas was lonely. The kind of drive where you could go miles without seeing another soul. Veteran truckers knew to keep their radios on, not just for road conditions, but for the comfort of another voice, cutting through the silence. Jack Lawson had been on the road for 15 hours straight, his eyes heavy, his mind drifting. The glow of his dashboard cast eerie shadows over his hands as he gripped the wheel. It was just past 2 a.m., the witching hour. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, the only light coming from his high beams cutting through the pitch-black desert. He hadn't passed another vehicle in over an hour. The night air pressed against the windows, thick and still. Then, a figure appeared on the side of the road. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was a man standing just outside the reach of his headlights. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't walking. He was just standing there, perfectly still, his face turned toward the truck. Jack's fingers twitched on the wheel. As he got closer, his headlights swept over the figure, and the man's head snapped toward him. Not a turn, not a nod, it snapped, a sudden, unnatural movement, like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. Jack's pulse hammered. The man's eyes were dark hollows. No white, no pupil, just empty voids that seemed to drink in the light. His mouth was stretched too wide, as if he had been screaming for eternity. His clothes were old, torn, flapping in the wind that wasn't there. Jack hit the gas. He didn't stop, didn't even look in his mirrors, just kept driving. His heart pounded against his ribs as the truck roared down the highway. Then his CB radio crackled. The static was sharp, grating against the silence. Then a voice, low, ragged. "Don't stop, Jack." Jack swallowed hard. His hand hovered over the radio dial, but he didn't touch it. He hadn't used his call sign, hadn't identified himself. How did they know his name? The radio crackled again. "Keep driving." Jack clenched his teeth. Then, a loud thump from the trailer. Jack nearly jumped out of his skin. Another thump. Then another. Someone was knocking on the outside of the trailer. Jack's blood turned to ice. He was going 65 miles an hour. How the hell could anyone be knocking? The pounding continued, slow and deliberate. Bang, bang, bang. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps. He gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. Then, from the CB, a whisper. "He's on your truck." Jack's stomach dropped. His headlights flickered. For just a split second, the road ahead disappeared into pure, suffocating blackness. And when the lights came back, the man was standing in the middle of the road. Jack barely had time to react. He yanked the wheel hard, the truck skidding dangerously to the right. The tires screamed against the asphalt as the rig jackknifed, the trailer swinging out behind him. For a moment, Jack thought he was going to die. Then, the truck shuddered, slowed, and came to a stop on the shoulder of the road. Jack's chest heaved. Silence. Nothing but the sound of his own breathing. The road ahead was empty. No man. No sign of anything at all. Jack wiped his sweating palms on his jeans. His hands were still shaking. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe he was just tired. Then, footsteps. Soft, slow, approaching from the back of the truck. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Then a single knock. Right on the driver's side door. Jack couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. He slowly turned his head toward the window and came face to face with the man. Black, hollow eyes. Mouth stretched too wide, a grin that didn't belong on something human. Jack slammed the truck into gear. His tires screamed as he peeled out, kicking up dust and gravel as he shot down the highway. He didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't even breathe until the lights of a truck stop appeared in the distance. Jack never took that route again. Other truckers had stories too. Stories of the man on the road, the man who could climb onto a moving truck, the man who whispered through the CB. No one knew what he was. But they all agreed on one thing. If you saw him, you never ever stopped.
Story number 6.
The Texas highway stretched for miles, an endless black ribbon cutting through the barren desert. Mark Reynolds had been driving for nearly 12 hours straight, his only company the steady hum of his 18-wheeler and the occasional flicker of static on his CB radio. He was used to the loneliness, but tonight something felt wrong. It was just past 3 a.m. The desert was eerily silent. No other cars on the road, no signs of life except for the faint glow of his dashboard. Then his headlights flickered. Once, twice. Mark frowned, tapping the light switch. A power surge, maybe. His rig was in good shape, but electrical glitches happened. Then the CB crackled. At first, just static, nothing unusual. Then a voice. Low, hoarse. "You're not alone." Mark's fingers tightened on the wheel. The voice was wrong. It wasn't another trucker. It didn't have that familiar gruffness, that radio distortion. It sounded too close, like someone was whispering right behind him. A chill ran down Mark's spine. He reached forward, twisting the dial. "Breaker, breaker," he said. "Anyone out there?" Silence. Then, "He's in the back." Mark's heart nearly stopped. His eyes darted to the mirror, scanning the dark stretch of his trailer behind him. Nothing. Just the road, empty. The CB crackled again. "He's waiting." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on the road. He had been driving too long. Maybe he was starting to hear things. Then, something thumped inside the trailer. Mark's skin turned to ice. The cargo was strapped down. There was nothing in there that could move. Another thump. Louder this time. Like something big shifting inside. Mark's hands were slick with sweat. His truck was going 70 miles an hour. There shouldn't be anything moving. Then, the dragging started. A slow, scraping sound, like something clawing at the metal walls. Mark's pulse hammered. Then the worst sound of all. A deep, guttural breathing. Not from the radio, from inside the cab. Mark's body went rigid. He could hear it, something slow, heavy. Behind him. Every nerve in his body screamed, "Don't turn around." But his hands were shaking. His breath was ragged, and then the breathing stopped. Silence. Mark's stomach clenched. Then slowly he looked into the mirror above his windshield and saw it, something crawling out from behind his seat. Its limbs were long, twisted, its skin gray, stretched tight over bones too sharp, too unnatural. Its face, Mark didn't have time to process it because its mouth, jagged and impossibly wide, opened, and it screamed. Mark's body reacted before his brain did. He slammed the brakes, the tires screeched, the truck shuddered violently. The thing lunged. Mark threw himself out of the cab. He hit the ground hard, rolling onto the asphalt as his truck skidded to a stop. His heart was slamming against his ribs, his breath coming in gasps. For a moment there was silence, then a creak. The driver's side door slowly swung open. Mark froze. The thing stepped out. It was taller now, unfolding itself, its long limbs twitching, adjusting to the open air. Its face was twisted in something that might have been a grin. It took one slow step forward, then another. Mark's body screamed at him to run. He scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. The thing tilted its head. Then a bright beam of headlights flooded the road. Another truck. Mark barely had time to react before the other rig barreled past, right through the thing standing in the road. And when the dust settled, it was gone. Mark was still shaking when the other trucker pulled over, stepping out cautiously. "You all right, buddy?" Mark could barely form words. But when he looked at his rig, his trailer door was wide open, and the inside was empty. He never found out what had been in there, and he never drove that route again.
Story number 7.
The road stretched endlessly into the night, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense Oregon wilderness. Heavy mist clung to the treetops, swirling like ghosts in the moonlight. Eddie Carson had been driving long haul for nearly 20 years, but something about this stretch of highway always set his nerves on edge. It was known as Dead Man's Pass, a winding, treacherous route through the mountains, notorious for fatal crashes, missing travelers, and stories that truckers whispered over cups of bad diner coffee. Eddie never believed in ghost stories, but that was about to change. It was just after 2 a.m. His rig rumbled down the empty road, the hum of the engine his only companion. The CB was quiet, no chatter from other truckers, no cars, no lights, just miles of forest pressing in on either side. Then his headlights flickered, just for a second. Eddie frowned, tapping the dashboard. Power surge, maybe. His truck was old but reliable. Then his radio crackled. Static. Then a whisper. "Get out!" Eddie stiffened. The voice was faint, distorted, barely more than a breath. He adjusted the dial. "Breaker, breaker," he called. "Anyone out there?" Silence. More static, then a single word. "Run." A chill slid down Eddie's spine. Before he could react, the truck lurched. The whole rig shuddered, the tires skidding like he'd hit black ice. His hands clenched the wheel, heart hammering. Then the headlights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the road. His breath hitched. The truck was still moving, but he was blind. No light, no sense of direction. Just the deafening roar of his engine in the pitch-black void. He slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a stop, the trailer fishtailing before settling. For a moment there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just pure suffocating silence. Eddie's pulse pounded in his ears. Then, a soft tap on the driver's side window. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he turned his head and saw her. A woman stood just outside the cab, so close. Her face was pale, almost luminescent in the dark. Her long, dark hair was wet, dripping onto her tattered dress. Her eyes, black. Empty pits, hollow and bottomless. Eddie's stomach twisted. She smiled. Then she vanished. Eddie gasped, his body rigid. The mist swirled outside, thick and unnatural. The road ahead was still shrouded in total darkness. Then something moved in his mirror, the reflection of his trailer. Something was inside it. Something big. Shadows shifted, a shape unfurled, limbs stretching at unnatural angles. Then it crawled out. Long, bony fingers gripped the edge of the trailer. Then another hand. Then a face. Not human. Mouth too wide. Teeth, long and jagged, stretching from ear to ear. Its body was wrong, like it had too many joints, too many legs. It twisted its head toward him and smiled. Eddie's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He slammed the accelerator. The truck roared to life, the tires screeching as he sped forward. The headlights flickered back on. The road was clear. But the thing, it was on his trailer. He could hear it scratching at the roof, skittering like an insect. Eddie's chest heaved. The CB crackled again, a voice urgent, desperate. "Don't stop." Eddie swallowed hard, then a loud bang from the roof. The metal dented inward. The thing was trying to get in. His hands were slick with sweat. The truck roared down the highway at nearly 80 miles an hour, but the scraping continued, moving closer to the cab. Then, silence. Eddie held his breath. Slowly, cautiously, he looked up and locked eyes with it. It was hanging upside down on the windshield, grinning. Its black eyes locked onto his, then its mouth opened wider, wider than any human mouth could, and it screamed. Eddie's world exploded into chaos. Glass shattered. The truck swerved. The horn blared as he fought to keep control. The thing lunged. But Eddie jerked the wheel hard. The truck veered onto the shoulder, the tires skidding through gravel. The thing lost its grip, and Eddie saw it fly off into the darkness. For a moment, he just sat there, shaking, breathing hard. The mist was gone. The headlights shone on an empty road. Nothing was there, no woman, no creature, just silence. Eddie didn't stop again until he reached a truck stop nearly 50 miles away. He staggered into the diner, hands still trembling. An old-timer sitting at the counter took one look at him and nodded. "You saw it, didn't you?" Eddie swallowed, throat dry. The man leaned in. "It follows the lonely ones." Eddie didn't respond. He never took that route again, and he never drove alone at night.
Story number 8.
The sky was a deep, inky black, the highway stretching endlessly through the heart of Louisiana's swampland. Jason Miller had been on the road for nearly 16 hours, exhaustion pulling at his eyelids. His rig, a worn but reliable Peterbilt, hummed steadily beneath him as he pressed forward into the lonely night. He checked the clock. 2:37 a.m., the witching hour. The CB radio was quiet, the usual trucker chatter absent. He hadn't seen another set of headlights in over an hour. Just miles of swamp on either side of the road, thick and dark, whispering with unseen life. Then, in the distance, something moved, a figure barely visible in the mist. Jason squinted. It was a man standing in the middle of the highway. Jason's hands tensed on the wheel. He tapped the horn, 2 short blasts. The man didn't move. He just stood there, shoulders hunched, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Jason's stomach twisted. He flashed his high beams. The figure remained still. As Jason drew closer, the headlights washed over him, and his breath caught. The man's face was wrong. His skin was gray, stretched too tightly over his skull. His eyes were gone, just empty sockets staring into the night. His mouth stitched shut with thick black thread. Jason's pulse spiked. He yanked the wheel hard to the right, tires skidding as he swerved to avoid the figure. His rig rattled violently, but he managed to stay on the road. Heart hammering, he stole a glance in his mirror. The man was gone. Jason exhaled sharply, forcing a nervous chuckle, just a trick of the light, his mind playing games. Then his radio crackled to life. Static, then a whisper. "He's in your truck." Jason's hands went ice cold. His breath hitched. The voice wasn't familiar. It wasn't another trucker. It was too close, like it was coming from inside the cab. A scraping noise echoed from the sleeper behind him. Long, slow. Jason's body locked up. Someone or something was in the back of his truck. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. Slowly, he reached for his hunting knife on the dashboard. Then, a voice. "Don't look." Jason froze. The whisper was right behind him now. He could feel it. The air in the cab turned cold, breath fogging in front of him. Then, something shifted in the mirror. Jason's stomach twisted. He forced himself to look. Just a quick glance at the rearview mirror, and he saw it. A shape, hunched and twitching, crouched in the shadows of the sleeper cab. It wasn't human. Too many limbs. Too many joints. Its fingers, long, bony, tipped with claws, gripped the edge of the seat. And its face, oh God, its face. A gaping black maw, stitched shut with thick thread, just like the man in the road. Then, slowly, the stitches began to unravel. Jason's breath hitched. The thing's mouth opened wider and wider, a deep, endless void. And it smiled. Jason's body reacted on instinct. He slammed the brakes. The truck skidded violently, tires screaming as he veered onto the shoulder. His heart pounded against his ribs. Silence. For a long, terrifying moment, he just sat there, breathing, shaking. The cab was empty. No sign of the thing. No sign of anything at all. Jason swallowed hard, rubbing his eyes. Had he imagined it? Then, the passenger door lock clicked open. His heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, his head turned, and the door swung open. There was nothing there, just the open swamp beyond the road. And then a whisper. "Run." Jason didn't hesitate. He slammed the truck into gear and peeled out, tires spitting gravel as he sped into the night. He never looked back. He never took that road again. And he never drove through the swamp after midnight.